Legal systems don't just appear out of thin air. And Australia's contract law, well, it has this fascinating origin story, one that starts in the UK but then takes a really unique Aussie turn. So today, we're going to explore that journey from inheriting a system to then bravely forging its own path.
So here's what we're going to cover. First, we'll look at the UK legal blueprint that Australia started with. Then we'll jump into a super common problem. What happens when you agree to agree? After that, we'll dig into a huge case all about a broken promise, see how a legal shield became a sword, and finally we'll wrap it all up by talking about why this stuff actually matters in the real world.
All right, let's start at the beginning. Australian law, especially when it comes to contracts, wasn't built from the ground up. Nope, it inherited this incredibly deep, centuries-old framework from English common law. It's kind of like being handed a giant, super detailed instruction manual right from day one. A really helpful way to think about this is like a parent-child relationship. The UK common law is the parent system, right? It provided all the foundational rules and big, important decisions. That makes Australian contract law the child. It inherited all those core family traits. And even now, a ton of key UK cases are still really persuasive in Australian courts. But, Australia was never just going to be a carbon copy. It took that legal DNA and started to tweak it, to adapt and innovate, and to really forge its own identity. And this is where the story gets good.
So let's dive into a perfect example of this Aussie innovation. It tackles a problem that I bet you've bumped into before. When you agree on the big stuff, you shake hands, but the formal, fancy contract hasn't been written up yet. So, is it a deal or not?
And that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? You've got the key terms jotted down, maybe on the back of a napkin, and you write subject to formal contract. Is that a legally binding agreement, or is it just another step in the dance of negotiation? For years, this gray area was a huge headache, causing all sorts of confusion and expensive fights.
In legal speak, this is what we call a preliminary agreement. It's that initial handshake deal, that first understanding before you get all the lawyers involved to dot the I's and cross the T's. The problem is, its actual legal power can be totally up in the air.
And this is where Australia really stepped up. The huge High Court case, Masters v. Cameron, didn't just solve one farm sale dispute. No way. It created a clear, practical test, a set of principles that courts could use to figure out what the parties actually meant. This brought some much-needed clarity to Australian business. It was a game changer. Okay, so we've talked about the certainty of written deals. Now, let's pivot to something a little messier, a little more human. What happens when a major promise is made and relied on, but there's no official contract anywhere in sight?
This is such a big question with massive real-world stakes. Imagine someone makes you a huge promise. And based on that promise, you go and spend all your savings, or you quit your job, or maybe even move your entire family. And then they just change their mind. With no signed contract, are you just out of luck?
Well, the law actually has this really powerful idea for situations just like that. It's called promissory estoppel. I know, it's a mouthful, but the concept is all about one thing: fairness. It's basically a legal safety net. It stops a person from going back on their word when it would be just plain wrong, causing serious, unfair harm to the person who trusted them. And this exact principle, this idea of fairness, was put to the ultimate test in what became one of Australia's most famous and important contract law cases ever, Walton Stores versus Maher. And this case, wow, it changed everything. And that case leads us to what is, honestly, probably the single biggest innovation in Australian contract law. It's the story of how a pretty old legal idea, used only for defense, was completely transformed into a powerful weapon for justice. See, for the longest time, estoppel was just a shield. That's it. If somebody sued you, you could pull out this shield and say, hey, wait a minute, you can't sue me for that because you promised me something else, and it's totally unfair for you to back out now. It was purely defensive, purely reactive. So you can see the difference right here. On one side, you've got the old-school traditional approach where estoppel is just a shield. It's a defense you use when you're already in a fight. But then, on the other side, you have this radical Australian idea that came out of the Walton Stores case. Estoppel could now be a sword. The result was absolutely revolutionary. After Walton Stores, you didn't have to wait around to get sued anymore. If you were harmed because someone broke a major promise, you could now be the one to march into court and start the legal action yourself, using that broken promise as your sword.
It created a whole new way to find justice, one built on fairness, not just formal paperwork. So, okay, we have definitely waded through some pretty complex legal ideas here. But what does any of this actually mean when you step outside the courtroom or put down the textbook? Why does this stuff matter?
Let's just tie this all together. We saw how Australian law grew out of its UK roots, but wasn't afraid to go its own way. We had the Masters v. Cameron case, which brought some desperately needed clarity to those subject to contract deals. And then the massive one, Walton Stores v. Mahar, which took promissory estoppel and turned it from a simple shield into a powerful sword. The bottom line? Australia didn't just follow the leader. It innovated, carving out its own important path in contract law. And that kind of leaves us with a final thought to chew on. These big legal ideas about fairness and relying on promises, they aren't just for corporations. It really makes you think, doesn't it? How many everyday promises in your own life might just carry a little more legal weight than you ever realized?